Yeah, so it's very nice to be here. And speaking in this forum, I've really enjoyed the Scene Society talks, and they've been extremely influential in my work here with the environmental humanities. And in fact, the talks that I've come to here now underpin 3 different research projects. So, I mean, in some ways, it's good to even rethink, what are the humanities? I have some friends here from humanities and arts-based practices in the university, so I'm not talking specifically to them with this, because they already kind of know. But this is an image from a local artist, a Gothenburg artist, who works with some education themes at hors d'oeuvre occasionally, but she is doing a performance here, I think it's called Queen of the Ocean. And this costume that she's made is made out of plastic that she's picked up from the edge of the water. It's sort of beautiful and compelling, and then when you find out that she's clothed in rubbish, it's also kind of freaky. So the humanities, as we kind of know them, consist of like history of ideas, intellectual history, literature, anthropology, archaeology, theology, religion. I think more contemporary work, we could say gender studies, post-colonial studies, science and technology studies, art history, musicology, philosophy. I mean, it's like saying the natural sciences. It's kind of, in some ways, meaningless because it's the entirety of human thought from a humanistic perspective. So, and of course, much of that thinking has been about the place that we inhabit, the environment that we live in. So there's always been environmental themed research within the humanities. So why the environmental humanities? That's a question that I really started to ask when I took on the job of coordinating the network for environmental humanities. And I'd really watched it develop in other locations around in Sweden and other places. And I could see that a really fertile area for us to develop is where we collaborate outside of our disciplines. So I thought it would be really nice to maybe introduce an idea of how that could look with the work of this artist, which I'll talk about in a moment. But here's just a short clip of a sound recording and some photographs from her work. So this is a Norwegian artist, and her name is Jana Winderen. She's sort of super famous in the very high-end fine art scene. She was a marine biologist, and she trained in Oslo. And the reason she had to leave that work, even though she didn't want to, was because the chemicals she used in the lab was so bad for her body. She actually was sort of allergic to the work she was doing. So she retrained as an artist at Goldsmiths. And she then began experimenting with a lot of different media, and she realised all she was doing was making stuff, just adding to stuff, and she didn't want to actually add to stuff. So then she started to think about what else she could do, and she became interested in recording the sounds under the water. So, I mean, you know, whale song as a kind of massage therapy soundtrack is really quite famous, but what she does is record fish swimming in corals as they touch corals, crustaceans at different times of the day, wild cod calling to each other. So she works up in the Barents Sea, from the Barents Sea all the way to the Pacific. And she makes these really kind of incredibly fine recordings. This is her underwater equipment. So when she shows it, she's currently on exhibition in a really amazing gallery in Vienna. And the sound recordings are timed with the tides. So when you go into the gallery, you have to check the tide timetable, and you go into the gallery and you will hear the sounds of what will be happening in the ocean at that time. And they play at high tide and low tide. So if you want to, interact with this exhibition, you have to actually go into the gallery at the right time of day, and you'll hear what's going on in the ocean. What a beautiful idea. There's something... So that's what she does now. She records sounds under the water. And it's really a activist-driven intention behind the work, because she really understands that people don't know what goes on under the water. Which, I think that's a really, really important role that work like this can play, is to open that world to a sensory experience, so that, of course, we can learn what goes on under the water. But I think the marine scientists, there are marine scientists here? They're usually, yes. This is your world. You already know what happens, but actually it's quite difficult to translate that into a language that people get on a bodily level, what we might call, if we're using cultural theory, an affective level. I won't go into what affect is, but you can look it up. But anyway, that's sort of something that we talk about here. So this is Kaiser in her bikini. I'm really sorry I didn't give you a warning about this. So the one thing is, we do have our own disciplines. So what is this edge that we can experiment with? We wouldn't really expect, I think, scientists to really understand the most sort of complex cultural theories that we would perhaps, use in humanities studies. And similarly, we can't do experiments in the lab. That's not our thing. But there's an edge where we can actually translate each other's work. And I was really thinking about, how to do that. And I came up with this idea that we could bring together a group of humanities scholars as an experiment here at Gothenburg University, because the marine science is so wonderful and so rich, as a bridge building exercise to begin a discussion with each other. So we began this experiment funded by Scene Society, and one of the really interesting aspects of this was that I noticed that the artists often work in really empirical ways that the scientists really understand. So here Kaiser is actually burning the sand. You can see she's got a lighter to find out what it does. And I think that's an approach that artists often take with the materials, is they engage with it really physically. And we had this frame of plastic in the sand and what a problem it was. So it's an experiment that she's doing, and she can tell you herself in the question time, to try and light it and see what happens to this material under, heat pressure. That's actually a very scientific approach. And conversely to that, this one of the kind of drivers of this project, or the kind of, emotion behind it, was a talk given to us by Martin Hasselhoff, who's a colleague of the scientists here, who told us about the effects of plastic in the water column. And he had this really beautiful presentation. Some of you might have seen it, that he uses for sort of public talks. And it's an animation, and it's about this bird, and it's really, really moving. And he had all of us really trying to keep back the tears. So I think there is actually some ground between us, where humanities scholars take a very empirical approach, and scientists often bring their passion, sometimes really moving passion, to their subjects. And I think people who work out in the field often are very enlivened by their experiences when they're doing their field work. So what I came up with was to take some science projects that were being currently run out of Chardonnay. I'm not saying China, I'm trying to say that island up the coast which I can't pronounce, Chardonnay. And we took a group of scholars, humanities scholars, to the research centre, the Rivian Research Centre, for a week in August. And we each had a science project that's being run up there to interact with. There were 3 projects that we took on as our focus. One was the sea farm. One was the Costa Harvard model being developed by Matthias Obst and Dawn, last name forgotten. And the third one was the OSPAR beach litter inventory. So they were our 3 starting points. And we had 5 different approaches to those science projects. Even before we started, we needed some instructions on how to look at the marine environment, because actually we don't have any experience of that. And so this woman is a science illustrator, and we did a workshop with her, having to take very, very careful notice of a shell. That was a very simple exercise, but how to draw it not as a creative form, but as a science illustration. It was a really, really interesting beginning to the week, because it made us change our focus. So I'll just say a little bit about each of these 5 stories. The first story is the story of seaweed, and that was the sea farm project that's being run up there, about the domestication of seaweed. And the project was sort of critiqued, I guess, by Richard Vingård, who is a literature scholar from Leer. And he listened to the presentation about seaweed and what the hope is of domesticating it and growing it commercially in the sea, and what a incredible crop this would be and how it could solve very many problems. And having listened to that talk, he had a very interesting question, and it was about domesticating wild species. Because from a humanities perspective, there's a question about colonising other species, which isn't asked actually in the frame of the science. And he wrote a very beautiful essay in response to that, where he looked at the history of seaweed as a cultural phenomenon along the west coast, along Bohuslän, and really asked questions. How do we respond to seaweed? How do we respond to the smell of it as it's rotting? How does the smell of it when it's not rotting but fresh really evoke for us memories of childhood and summer and the salt and things that are healthy? And how do we move between those feelings of it being about health to being about rotting, decay? So really interesting questions, and I think finally he arrives at the question, does the seaweed want to be domesticated? And that's a really a multi-species point of view, and it's really interesting, because probably not, and it might fight back. So that's a really kind of fun idea to take from literature. And he found these really beautiful sort of naive drawings in the Bohuslän Museum about the historic uses of seaweed, including sort of fantastic from I think that's the spa in Uddevalla. Yeah. The next one, actually this is not a photo of Catalina, but she's Catalina Lanstrom is a science and technology historian or scholar. What's it called now? Science and Technology Studies, History of Science and History and Philosophy of Science. Anyway, yeah. So she asks. So she's working with the project being run by Matthias and Dawn, which maybe some of you are also familiar with. It's building a big data model of the entire Costa Harvard ecosystem, from the DNA to the biggest things, whatever they are. And that's a really interesting thing to do. And she is very skilled at asking questions of scientists, like why, for whom, and how would it be used. Because actually she's been working in this field for a very long time, and she's seen a lot of enthusiasm for building models, which are then built and never used again. And she's also really interested in asking people who live in the environment, who don't work within a science discourse, what do they think of big data science like that? And how would they relate to it? And would it have any impact on them? And could they even imagine what it is? So also a really interesting set of questions. Yeah. The artists, stories of sand. So this is referring back to that initial image of Kaiser setting the sand on fire. So the artists did something really interesting. They took their bodies into the place that we were investigating with their materials. It's not about sitting in a room and drawing pictures of the sea or doing nice watercolours. They had these huge pieces of paper that were, well, Kaiser can tell us in a minute the qualities of it, but it didn't dissolve. It was made of cotton. So, and, you know, it was bought specifically for that purpose, so that it could be put into the water of the ocean. It could be wrapped around rocks. It could have sand ground into it. It could be set on fire. It could be... So it actually could go on a lot of journeys and capture the traces of the bodies and the water and the sand interacting. So here you can see it's being pushed into the water and accumulating. And actually after it dried, we licked it. We licked it as an experiment to see if it was salty. So here's somebody with the paper on their body and the seaweed, and she floated there for really a long time, long enough to actually come ashore. Really slowly in with the waves until the head was touching, and with her eyes closed, with no connection to anything but the rhythm of the water. And afterwards she got out and went, just like she got off a boat, because the rhythm of the water had just come right into her body. Really interesting work. So that paper, it's not an artwork as you might think of it in the gallery. It's a trace of that moment of engagement, and that's the same person. On the wall that you might recognise from the inventory beach on Saltør. So this was all sort of oriented towards these the beach litter inventory, the other projects I mentioned. And here's the results starting to come together, and you can see the traces start to make something interesting when they're put next to each other. There's some kind of context growing. It's still forming, this work. It's not yet finished, and of course that's not the work for exhibition, it's the process. So it's the lab, if you like. Yeah, and then there's me. So I worked with an archaeologist, Christina Fredengren from Stockholm University. I'm a historian. So we had a temporal approach. We were really interested in the time layers at the inventory beach, where maybe not all of you are familiar with this project, but it's been going for 15 years. This beach has a sign at the entrance saying, please don't clean the beach, because community groups do like to come along and clean beaches. So what they're doing is every 4 months or so, volunteers fill out a survey form walking along the beach collecting material, so that the scientists can actually see what's washing ashore and take an inventory of how it's changing. And of course this isn't capturing the actual beach rubbish, because it comes and goes with storms and tides, and this is just to get snapshots. And the snapshots are terrifying. So now I've spent a really long time in that database, adding it up and kind of doing things in Excel to try and work out from 2002 to now what's happened. And it's really shocking. That's 15 year. That's a 15-year timescale. As a historian and archaeologist, we're interested in much deeper timescales, and that's something that often falls outside of the view of science, is a deep time approach. You can maybe take sedimentary cores, but there are other actual archives and ways of, finding out what happened in the past. I was really fascinated to find out that the name of this place is Ranrike, which local people already know, Ranrike. And we started to think about what that was, and Christina's an expert in deep time cultural heritage in Sweden. She's part of that other thing I can't say, the Heritage Board. And so we were really interested in following this name because it's a trace, it's a deep time trace, Ranrike. Ran is the goddess of the sea mentioned in the Icelandic sagas, written by Snorri Sturluson. And Ran is a very fierce god. She is in charge of drowning sailors and pulling them into her net. So it's a very powerful figure or image. And she has 9 daughters. And when I started to do research on the 9 daughters, I was fascinated because I'm going to read out their names to you now. And yeah, I've had some Icelandic lessons to say this, but we'll see how it goes. Himmingliva is the clear water through which the sky can be seen. And remember, these are millennia old words and meanings. They're really moving. The poetry of them is so exquisite. And this is from a people's culture who is no longer extant. It's not a living culture anymore. Himmingliva, the clear water through which the sky can be seen. That is the perspective from under the water. It's not the water we can see through. It's the water to look through up to the sky. What a fantastically poetic image. Blúddahada. Any Icelandic speakers here, feel free to help. Blúddahada. Bloody hair is the daughter of rivers, creeks, streams that flow into the sea, the veins and arteries of the land. Blúddahada, blood. Duba, the pitching wave, small oceans, the fogs and mists of the sea. Hevring, heaving storms, known as the morning's mistress, the mistress of grief. She is in charge of the horizontal waves, currents, the horizontal currents, and she's the twin of Hrun, the sucking whirlpool, the vertical goddess. So the horizontal waves and the sucking water. Bulja, Birja, the surf, the rider of the surf, the breaker. Kolga, the ice flows from the Arctic, icebergs, cold currents coming from the Arctic. They move around the North Sea. Drubn, coastal erosion, the waves that hit the coast and always trying to steal the land, pull it into the sea, crashing onto the cliffs, crashing onto the sand and pulling it into the sea. And the tides, king tides, billowing tides. Is the keeper of the sea's relationship to the moon and the tides coming and going, flux and flow. So they are really powerful images located in the waters in which that plastic is washing ashore. So these goddesses live at the bottom of the sea and they do something really special. They turn a salt mill. So they provide the salt for the water, which is the beginning of life. So this is a creation story. And it's also extremely scientific. So this is a people who we don't know who they are, but they left these traces. They had a taxonomy of the water. They had a theory of how life starts. And these goddesses give birth to the first person in the Nordic sagas. So it's really, really interesting to put that in a scientific context where what is happening, and I've been learning this from my science teacher who has to teach me like I'm, a 12-year-old, but still she's very patient, about endocrine disrupting chemicals in the water and how they interrupt the beginnings of life. And when you put that together with the beginnings of life coming from the sagas and the creation stories, the mythic creation stories, it's a really powerful resonance for our time to tell us what we're messing with. We're messing with the fundamental building blocks of life on Earth with chemical toxicity. So I think that's my new project. So I'm going to be following those themes for, well, I don't know how long, but I think maybe that's an introduction to the environmental humanities, enough for the moment, and perhaps sometime I can come back and present that research in a little more detail.